looking towards federal grants, different kinds of strategic partnerships, peer-to-peer learning with other agencies around the country, all of that kind of thing.
Okay.
You probably want to close that too so you don't get it. Sorry. So it's kind of a nice opportunity. A lot of these are things we're already working on. These are not new ideas or principles, but they are things that it's great to be seen already as playing a leadership role in this work, and then also to get additional support to kind of be a model or create a blueprint for the rest of the country around this kind of work.
Obviously, is that they see a drop in crime, right?
Well, we're hoping both for crime reduction, but maybe as significant as that is the strongest possible relationship between police and community. So to strengthen those relationships, particularly between segments of the community that maybe have historically had less trust in police, and also just issues around transparency of police data, sharing that, accountability, how we handle complaints, how we deal with use of force, how we incorporate technology. So it's a whole series of things designed to both kind of improve how we go about reducing crime, but also how we go about building the strongest possible relationship with our residents.
So if there were one group in Tucson that you think has had a tough time getting along with the Tucson Police Department, who would you be focusing on, and what would you do to gain their trust?
Yes, I don't know that there's any one particular group that necessarily has had a poor relationship with the department, but I think relationships, frankly, can be better almost in every neighborhood of the city. This is like a city with many different neighborhoods within a city, and so there are different needs and concerns and interests. In some cases, people have had more, in some cases less contact with the police. In some cases, it's been based around needing police services. In other cases, perhaps it's been because of a quality of life issue or a crime pattern. But I think clearly on a larger national basis, there have been various minority groups in this country that have historically not had as good relationships with the police. We have a large Hispanic community here, a not quite so large Black community, but also a large, a fairly good size Native American community. There are opportunities certainly to build inroads with all of those residents, but this effort is by no means limited to any one particular racial or ethnic group. It's really about finding ways to build common ground and improve relationships, be more accountable to, and provide better service to residents across the board in every neighborhood.
So how are you going to do that?
Well, I think that's where these recommendations from this President's 21st Century Task Force are very helpful, because they talk about using social media more effectively as a means for communication and exchange of information, means being more transparent with information, including data about things even like traffic stops or basically how we use force, citizen complaints, any of a number of things. They talk about ways in which we can learn from other police agencies about best practices, things that have been helpful in other jurisdictions when it comes to reducing crime, strategies for community engaged policing. How do we go into a neighborhood, maybe an area that perhaps is not as trustful of police, and build stronger relationships with young people, figure out how we open up dialogue about issues involving policing, how we help sort of identify what are the priorities in different neighborhoods that we can adjust our services to be more attuned to. So I don't think there's any one single strategy. The report is structured around 6 larger areas, but the idea is that we would get technical support, additional training, resources, the opportunity perhaps to go after various grants for funding in several different areas that will allow us to do better policing for the residents of Tucson.
Social media, how has that hurt enforcement? How are you going to use it to help enforcement?
Well, I think it can be challenging sometimes because, one of the things that we both like but also struggle with when it comes to social media is its very instant and sometimes unforgiving nature, right? I mean, things go out very quickly, and that information that people may initially put out about social media, on social media, is not always accurate. And so word can travel very quickly through, whether it's Twitter or Instagram, whatever it might be, that is not always accurate, that may represent just a rumor that's going around or somebody's particular account of an incident or something that happened that doesn't always turn out to be what really did happen. So that's certainly one of the challenges. People have an expectation of getting information very quickly. They get that through social media, but it's not always accurate.
And what would you do to change that?
Well, I think trying to fight that's like, trying to push back against an ocean. Yeah, I'm not sure that that's entirely possible, but I think what we can do is use social media more ourselves as a way to put information out that residents can go to and get more, for example, whether it's crime prevention information, whether it's information about a particular issue we're dealing with, whether we want to help people better understand how we address or deal with citizen complaints, whether it's information about a particular use of force incident, any of a number of things. We have the opportunity to use social media, whether it's Facebook, our webpage, or even things like Twitter, to link people to more accurate information or to give people a broader picture of information to look at to get a better sense of what happened and to feel more connected to the agency.
People pulling out their phones, videotaping, has that changed things?
Well, no question, it's changed things. I think in some cases it's certainly made the job more challenging because when you have a lot of people who are filming you, sometimes that can get in the way of a particular police activity or arrest. But I also think it's good because it gives one more perspective of what happened. Officers, as is clear, are increasingly wearing body cameras themselves to capture what happened, but even that only captures one perspective of an incident. We know sometimes, depending on where you're placed or how you're looking at something, an incident can look very different. And so I actually think that cell phone video can be helpful in showing what happened at a scene or an incident, but sometimes folks who, in their zeal to capture an incident on cell phone video can become, can be a distraction to officers, can compromise safety under certain circumstances. So, it's about that finding a reasonable middle ground. People have to be given the right, of course, to use cell phones to capture an incident, but they don't have the right to actually interfere in a process or to obstruct an officer in terms of how they're doing their job just because they want to get footage of something. So it's a check and balance.
The body cams that officers wear, will that be a part of one of the pillars?
So yes, actually, one of the pillars deals with accountability and another deals with transparency. So cameras fall right into both of those areas because the cameras help both preserve a record of what happens in incidents, and that record can be helpful in terms of investigating a crime, memorializing an interview, or even refuting or, I suppose in some cases, supporting a complaint involving an officer. But they're one more piece of evidence that can be helpful in terms of accountability and ultimately transparency about what happened. Cameras will also be helpful to us from the standpoint of training. So we have the opportunity to go back ourselves and look at how we handled a particular incident, sometimes just from a tactical or officer safety standpoint, and think, could we have done this better? Or how can we use this as a teachable moment? Sometimes we're not always aware of how we come across when we're communicating, right? And so it can be very revealing. I know someone like yourself, you're used to seeing yourself and you know what kind of communicator you are, but police officers aren't always aware of how they're coming across, and what may seem like businesslike or professional to them may seem a bit abrupt or uncaring or detached to somebody else. So sometimes the chance to look at that on camera and say, let's think about could there be a different way you might have approached this conversation? That can be a good learning opportunity, again, facilitated by body camera footage.
Refresh my memory on how many officers you have and what percentage will be wearing body cams.
So all of our patrol officers will be eventually wearing body cameras. The challenge we face right now is that in the past, prior to me getting here, one of the things that Chief Villasenor was able to secure was money for a pilot program that provided about a fifth of our patrol officers with body cameras. Unfortunately, after that point, things sort of remained status quo. And we are now working to change that. We, in fact, have a pending grant from the Bureau of Justice Assistance out of Washington that I hope will be successful in obtaining, that would allow us to outfit the remainder of our patrol officers with body cameras probably closer to the end of the year if we get positive word about that grant in the fall. So we still have a ways to go, and even if we're not successful with that grant, we're going to look at funding one way or the other so that we can have our entire patrol complement, which would include traffic, which would include, obviously the officers responding to calls, all of those kind of folks outfitted with body cameras.
We hear that term, the Ferguson effect.
Mm-hmm.
Is it in play? Do you see it?
I don't think most professional police officers are unwilling or unable to do their job out of a sense of fear or anxiety associated with somebody filming them on whether it be a cell phone or frankly on their own body cameras. I think it obviously means you have to be mindful of what you're doing, how it appears to others, perhaps not just at the time you're doing it, but down the road. So does that make the job a little more challenging? Fairly, in all fairness, I think it does. But is that causing officers to step back from doing their work? I don't think so. I think that officers that were reluctant to really be more involved with the community, or be more prone to make traffic stops, be more excited about answering calls. Mm-hmm. Those folks are still the same way now as they were in the past. I think that people that maybe were less excited about some of the aspects of their job, I suppose you can hide behind the Ferguson effect or things like that to justify a lack of activity or engagement with the public. But that's not what I've seen here. What I've seen here are a very professional group of police officers that are totally up for, and in fact, I think energized and excited about the interactions they can have with the community. And so the idea that that might be filmed by somebody, whether it be another member of the community or whether that's on their own body cameras, I think has pretty little effect on how they do their job.
Tucsonans out and about, are they going to be able to tell something different about the Tucson Police Department?
So what I think they'll see that's the same is a high level of service and commitment to doing policing here in Tucson. What I think they will see different is an increased number of officers assigned to patrol out on the streets and in the neighborhoods. I think they will see a greater level of engagement with residents in a variety of different forms, whether it's neighborhood meetings, different community gatherings of various kinds. I think we're trying to carve out more opportunities for officers to really get to know residents in specific geographic areas where they're assigned, to build that relationship over time and to become really effective partners in problem solving, whether we're talking about a crime issue or a quality of life issue, traffic issue, whatever it may be. So I think we're trying to give officers more tools, more technology, more training, more resources to do what I like to think of as full service policing. I think the quality of the work is going to remain consistent with what people have already become accustomed to, and that's very positive. But I think, again, more resources, a little stronger presence out in the field, some additional training, some additional technology, all of those things are going to allow us to really step up our game And I think that's going to be a positive. People will see some of the impact of that, and I think they'll see some of those relationships really building, developing, and flourishing in their neighborhoods, which would benefit everybody.
What you've just described, is that the same mindset that you used in Richmond to improve things there?
Very much so. We found that, in order to bring down violent crime, we really needed the partnership and trust of residents, particularly in the neighborhoods where a lot of that crime was occurring. The only way we could do that was to get officers out into those neighborhoods, have them become familiar, almost a neighborhood fixture, out of the cars, on bikes, at neighborhood meetings, stopping by businesses, schools, churches, other places, really getting to know community on a first name basis. And people, what I would hear sometimes in Richmond is people would say, well, I don't trust the cops, but I like Officer so-and-so who's in my neighborhood. And see, that's a victory from my standpoint, because policing really is local. And so if residents feel like there's even one or two, I'd like them to appreciate the whole department, but even if there's just a couple of officers that they know and trust, that's a huge inroad, and that allows us to strengthen that partnership and really accomplish a lot. So we found that was very effective in Richmond. I think that can be very effective here. I already see many officers who are well down this path of building relationships, but they've struggled because in many cases they've been moved around from area to area. They've been so busy going from call to call, they really haven't had the time to be able to catch their breath, spend some time with residents. So we're trying to change that dynamic a little bit, and I think the results will be positive, and they're very consistent with what this 21st century policing task force, they're consistent with the whole series of recommendations that come from that task force.
If there's one complaint that we've heard and covered any number of times at Channel 9, they've heard a lot in the past, well, your burglary just didn't match up on the scale.
Right.
We had other things that were just
Yes.
more pressing.
Yes.
We still going to hear that?
Well, I'd like to see that change, because when you're a victim of a burglary or another property crime, that may be your only interaction with the police, and that's a big deal. And so I'd like to give officers, first of all, more time to be able to really help people who have been victims of these crimes. I'd like to even take a step back and have officers more engaged in neighborhoods so that we can create a culture of prevention that helps us cut down on the number of some of these crimes in the first place. I mean, it's great to get good service once you're a victim, and if we can solve the crime and make an arrest, even better. But I think almost everyone would agree if we could avoid the crime, keep it from happening in the first place, a lot of which can be accomplished through good partnerships between residents and police, prevention efforts in neighborhoods. I think we can really make a difference in the number of property crimes we have in this community. But I do think that having officers with the tools, the resources, and the support they need to spend a little more time on these cases, to be able to respond to the calls a little sooner, and to be able to do a little better follow-up, even working more closely with detectives who are now be assigned out at the division level. I think all of those things will help us lower the rate of property crimes like burglary and increase the level of citizen satisfaction in the community around those types of incidents.
Okay. And so what I'm hearing you say is probably the complaints that we hear probably a lot of times come from those property crimes.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
I think a lot of them do, because that's a real sense of violation, and then you sort of add insult to injury when people have to wait a very long time and when they're not sure when the police are going to arrive or what kind of follow-up is going to happen. So we need to figure out some strategies not only to prevent a lot of these crimes, but also to improve how we respond, ways that we can deliver the best service, some meaningful strategies for follow-up after somebody has had a report taken. I think this is all, really it all ties in very nicely to a lot of these recommendations from this task force.
And you may have told me this and it went over my head, but how many officers do we have? How many could we have? Are we at full force or what?
So part of our efforts with reorganizing the department since I started at the beginning of the year, and also kind of as a consequence of needing to make some pretty substantial budget reductions in line with the city's structural budget deficit, has been to bring us down to a level of police officers we can really afford to have out in the community, not just a number that we're not really close to attaining and that we can't properly equip or train or provide the technology for. So where we are now is roughly in the mid 900s when it comes to sworn officers that throughout the department. That's not entirely in patrol, that's throughout the agency. We are looking over the next year potentially getting down into the mid 800s due to the budget restructuring that we've done. But I don't think that's going to be a problem. If we go lower than that, it will be. But I think if we can handle the mid 800s, if we sort of realign where those officers are assigned. So what we've already done, and this is already a plan in motion, is many of the officers that were working other kinds of details outside of patrol are now coming back to patrol. So we'll actually have a larger patrol presence than we've had in the past out on the streets. We're figuring out creative ways where we get folks working together, making the most of the resources we have. We're going to be able to have 3 academies going forward in the coming year. One starts in July, and then there'll be 2 more. When I say coming year, I mean fiscal year, which starts July 1st. So this will help us at least get back on a solid financial footing. And then I think both the manager and I believe the council as well understands the need to be able to grow the department back into that 900, 1,000 range for the longer term. But unless you have your financial house in order, you can't do that kind of growth. We can't even attract people to work here if they don't believe the city is going to be on financial footing that's solid. So I think we have a good plan to get us through this kind of rebuilding year that lies ahead. We've had really good cooperation from our labor unions in the department. I think people understand that if we're in a better fiscal position, we can then move forward and get to a place where not only we have more officers, but where our pay becomes more competitive. But all that said, we're looking to actually improve how we deploy officers, how we train them, the kind of equipment we provide them with. We just issued all our officers cell phones, which will be useful not only for their work with the community, but also as a way of sharing data, crime information, all kinds of things, again, compatible with the technology recommendations in this report. So, I mean, I think we're being smart with the resources we have. And we're going to get through the year ahead, and then I think we can move, I hope, I'm an optimist, I think we can move into a rebuilding period, because I would like to see us closer to 1,000 officers ultimately. It's a big city, spread out, a lot of needs, but luckily we also have a really amazing group of cops that work here.
And what was it that caused this need to cut the budget? The economic climate, or what?
Yeah, so the city has been headed towards this financial crisis, and I think council manager would all agree it's a crisis. I mean, we were in a period really where we were talking about a potential $45 million structural deficit for this city, which is a crisis. Fortunately, we have a city manager and a council that has really been willing to step up. Every department was asked to look at ways they could do the work differently, better choices that we could make given the resources that we have. And so the council, in fact, is about ready to give their final stamp of approval to a budget that finally and really comprehensively addresses that structural deficit. So going forward, that puts us in a much better position to look at some growth in the future and to look at regrouping some of those programs and services that none of us want to go without. But again, you can only have what you can pay for. And, government, not unlike private individuals, there's only so long you can rack things up on the credit card, right? I mean, at some point, you got to be able to pay the bills. And if you can't, you face really financial catastrophe. So steps have been taken to avoid that, but because police and public safety in general are the biggest component of any city government, we've had to make some real cuts to do that. I think this has given us, though, again, on the positive side, an opportunity really to look at what is it that we're trying to do, what are the services that are most important to people, and what are ways that we can use resources that are out there, including, in this case, some supportive resources from the federal government. We'll always take that. That can help us get through this period and continue to provide a high level of service to residents.
Okay. I think you can get some 2 shots.
Okay.
Okay.